Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I get to share the new Spellbinders clubs for June 2026. First, we have the embossing folder of the month called Pineapple Pop. Then we have the 3D embossing folder of the month called Island Style. The press and foil plate of the month is called Hibiscus Bloom. Absolutely gorgeous bloom there. And it has a border die with it. I'm going to create two different cards with this one. The stencil of the month is called Plumeria Spray. And then we have the clear stamp as well as the coordinating die of the month called This Way to Rainbows. I forgot to show the foil with the press and foil plate of the month. This month it is some matte gold foil. For the stitching die of the month, it is called Luau Beats. We've got some drums here as well as a guitar and some florals. Then we have the die of the month called Mahalo Sea Turtle. Absolutely adorable, and I love that background die with it. The large die of the month is called Tropical Blooms. There's so many different blooms in here. I love that one as well. This here is Penguin in Paradise. This is the All Clubs Crate bonus for this month. So cute. And then we have the All Clubs Crate exclusive item called Aloha Hulu. Love this. I'm going to make an interactive card with that one at the end of the video. The first thing I want to do though is do my foiling with the press and foil plate of the month. I'm going to foil it as well as use it in the Better Press. So we're going to get two different cards, one with foiling, one in the Better Press system. So I'm using my glimmer system here. I have it nice and hot. I put the plate on there with the pattern side up. The foil goes on there with the pretty side down, and I'm foiling on some hammer milk cardstock. And then the plates that come with that glimmer system go on top of there and you press the timer button. Once that timer button stops flashing, we put it through the Platinum 6 machine. You need both the heat from the glimmer system as well as the pressure from a die cutting machine in order to do that foiling. And there is a list on the Spellbinder site of compatible machines to use with it. Now for my first foiling, I did both the hibiscus and the sentiment. For the second foiling, I only did that sentiment. I'm actually not going to be using the sentiment part of the hibiscus and sentiment. There is a die in that set, but it only cuts out the border. It doesn't cut out the sentiment. So I want to use that second one for the inside of the card where I use the hibiscus on the front of the card. I'm also doing my solid hot foiling at the same time. I end up not using it. Sometimes when I do the solid hot foiling, I use the piece as is. Sometimes I use it as a mat on my cards, and sometimes I just use it as specialty paper and die cut out of it. For this, I just don't use it in the video. I thought I was going to, but inspiration didn't strike as I was creating, so I opted not to. For my hibiscus foiled image, I'm using Copic markers to color them. So the very first colors I'm using is RVOO, RVO2, and then RVO9. I start with the OO and then I go in with the O2 and just kind of flick the color out. I want it to blend in with that. I said OO before, I mean OOO, RVOO. So I flick out the color here and then I go in with that RVOO and flick back and blend those colors together. So I want it to look like a natural transition, and that Copic marker, the alcohol-based marker, doesn't do anything. It doesn't harm that foiling at all. However, if you use darker colors, you can see the color over top of that foiling. So when I go in and do the RVO9 for the center of the flower, you can see it over top of that foiling. But once I'm done coloring with the RVO9, I go back in with the RVO2 to blend it out, and it just mutes the color that is on the foil, so you can't see it nearly as much as you could when it was just the RVO9 on there. So I keep working on this, blending those together until I get a nice transition. I want the center of my hibiscus to be nice and dark, but I want the outer edges to be really, really light. I want it to look just light, feminine. I want to be able to see all of that foiling. And I don't want to overtake that foiling with too much color. So as I'm working this, I love working with Copic markers because you can keep going over the same area and you're not going to have that paper start to pill. If we were working with some dye-based markers, you'd have to work fairly quick because the paper starts to pill from the dye-based ink in them. For the center of that flower, I just went over that center with some YO2. It turned or blends with that RVO9 that's in there, so it turns a little bit more orange, but it changes the color up from the center of the flower just a little bit. For my leaves, I'm using YG63 and YG67. So I start by putting the YG63 in there, then I go in and flick a little bit of that YG67 out from the center, then I go back with the lighter color and blend those two together. So when I first started working with Copic markers and coloring with Copic markers many years ago, I learned to do the light color first, then the dark color, and then go back to the light color. Or if there's 3 shades, do the light, the medium, the dark, then back to the medium, and then back to the light. So that is what I'm comfortable with. That is what I tend to do. However, I do know that there are people out there that go from the dark color first, put the dark color on first, then the medium color, and then go in and blend it all with the light color. I definitely would suggest trying both ways and seeing what works best for you, because everyone has different preferences. There's not one size fits all for everything. So try it both ways and see which way works best for you and which way you prefer the result of. So I'm doing all of the leaves the same colors, doing it the same method. For the leaves that go behind the flowers, I'll do a little bit more of that green right behind where that leaf goes behind that flower petal to add that little bit of shadow. But I just love that green with the gold. It really brings out the gold of the foiling. So once I have those colored, I'm going to match up the die around the outside of that foiling. I do use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape that in place before cutting it. I want to make sure that that die doesn't move on me. So by taping it in place, I know that it's going to stay exactly where I put it. Now you could easily use this whole piece without die cutting. I wanted to have a front to my card that was just a partial front, basically, where we have the die cut edge and on the inside of the card we have our sentiment. I wanted to do this for 2 reasons. First of all, I thought it would look a little bit more interesting than just the traditional A2 card with a full front and a full middle. Secondly is when I foiled my sentiment as well as my florals, that sentiment is just a little bit off the page, so it's not going to get a good result anyways. Now for the matte for this card, I'm using the Pearl Finish gold cardstock from the Gold Treasured cardstock pack. I'm going to put a matte around the sentiment on the inside, so I trim that down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. For my foiled front here that is die cut, I trim that down to the same size, except because I've already cut one edge off, I'm cutting just a sliver off the top and the bottom till it is 5¼ and then a little bit off of the long edge there. I trim my gold pearl cardstock to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. To add a little bit of color to my background of my floral piece here, I'm just using a little bit of tumbled glass distress ink. I'm trying to keep most of it on the background. I'm going to get a little tiny bit of blue on the flowers and on the leaves. On the leaves, you're never going to see it because that green is darker than the blue. On the flowers, it doesn't look out of place. I don't have a lot of ink there. I just want the hint of a sky behind it. I wanted it to not be just plain white cardstock. For my mat here with that pearl finish, I'm going to put that die cut foiled piece on it, leaving just a little bit of a border around it. Then I put my die so that that die cut edge is matching the die cut edge from my foiled piece. Tape that in place with that Best Ever Craft tape and then ran it through my die cutting machine. Now we're going to do this same step one more time by layering my pearl piece on the front of the card and then matching that die up. Now with that pearl piece on the front of the card, I have a border around the top and the bottom and the left side that's probably about 1/16 inch. What I do is I center the top and the bottom and then I just slide the left side over so it's equal to the amount that is on the top and the bottom. I just eyeball it. I don't measure anything. Then I put that die on and repeat that same process to die cut the front of the card. This is the way that I tend to do it because I find it easiest. Once I have all of those pieces die cut together, we can start to assemble the card. So I'm going to add my gold layer for the inside of the card. That is once again trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. My foiled sentiment piece is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4. Then we have our pieces for the front of the card. So the die cut edge is going to line up for all of them. And because when I was die cutting them, I laid the pieces on top of the piece that was going to be below, I'm going to have those layers on the top and the bottom and the side. They're going to be all nice and even. They're going to be like 1/16 inch. So once I have those pieces together, I do put an acrylic block on there. I like to put an acrylic block on there, hold everything nice and flat. It frees my hands to work with other things if I want. So we have a really simple card here, but I just love that die cut edge on it and that we have the sentiment peeking in from the inside of the card rather than having it on the front of the card. Before I go and do any more cards, I'm going to take the clear stamp of the month, This Way to Rainbows, and I'm going to choose a bunch of the different sentiments and I'm going to heat emboss them on some hammer mill cardstock with some gold embossing powder and then die cut them with the coordinating dies. Now this way I'm going to have a bunch of sentiments ready to go to pick and choose from while I'm creating the rest of the cards in this video, and I end up creating 11 cards total. But I want to have those all finished, ready to go. I don't want to stop during each card and make a sentiment for that card. So I just picked a bunch of them. You could even repeat this process a couple times and create just a pile of sentiments. Any sentiments I have left over when I'm creating, I just put them in a little Ziploc bag with that stamp set or with that press plate set. So next time I go to use that set, I may have a sentiment already done, ready to go for whatever I'm creating at that point. I used some embossing powder tool on that hammer mill cardstock before stamping it with some Versamark ink. Then I pour on some super fine embossing powder. This is gold embossing powder. I wanted it to coordinate with the gold foiling on the first card there. So I pour that powder on there, tap off any excess. If by chance you have any flakes of embossing powder sticking where you don't want them to go, just take a soft brush and brush them off before using your heat tool to melt that powder on there. Once everything is melted, I let it dry for, I want to say probably about 10 seconds. It doesn't need to be too long. And then I match up my dies and I tape them on with some Best Ever Craft tape so that they stay exactly where they're supposed to be while I'm die cutting them. They're really easy to line up, and by taping them in place, I can make sure that that tape or that die does not move on me while I'm doing that die cutting. There's one sentiment there that doesn't have a coordinating die, so once I've die cut all of my sentiments, put them or pulled them out of there, put them to the side, and then taken the dies off there, I'm just going to use my guillotine trimmer in order to trim that down. And when I do that, I use the right side of that clear guard on my trimmer. I'll have the sentiment just peeking out just a tiny little bit, making sure that it's nice and even. I will use that finger guard to hold that piece down, and then I will trim it. I'll do that to all 4 edges. So with my sentiment off to the side, ready to go, I'm ready to work on my second card using that press and foil plate. So this time I'm working with some watercolor cardstock. I have a piece here that's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I'm going to tape it to the clear top plate of my Better Press system. I'm going to line up my plate on my Better Press system, and I'm only using the blooms there. I'm going to heat emboss this onto that watercolor cardstock and watercolor these images. I thought these hibiscus would look absolutely gorgeous watercolored. So I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on that watercolor cardstock, ink my press plate up with some Versamark ink, put the clear plate onto the base and run it through my die cutting machine in order to press that plate onto my paper. Once I have that done, I can take my plate away, clean it off and put it away, and use that same super fine embossing powder on my plate image on that watercolor cardstock. And just like before, if there's powder sticking anywhere you don't want it to go, just use a soft brush and brush it off. Now, once again, for press plate sentiments especially, but I also like to do it with images if I have it available. I do like to use superfine embossing powder because I find you get a lot more detail with it, and I just really like the results. If I don't have superfine embossing powder in a color that I want to use, I'll just use regular powder, but when it's available, I do like to use that superfine. So once I've cleaned my image up, I use that embossing tool to melt that powder onto the cardstock. For this one, I'm not going to trim it down. I'm going to keep the complete image rather than using the coordinating die to trim it down, but you certainly could if you wanted that side edge look for this particular card. Now for watercoloring for this card, I'm using some distress reinkers. These are reinkers for those ink pads. I love using them for watercolors because I already have them, so it just gives it another use rather than just using them for refilling my ink pads. I can use them as watercolors, and they're nice vibrant colors that you can get a lot of variety in the color variations in each, or the saturation. So if I use it right out of my little ink well there, I'm going to have a lot of color to it. But if I blend in water from my brush, I'm going to have a lighter shade of that color. And I have a little bit of control over how much or how dark or how light it is. I'm using a water brush that has water right in the handle. So right off to my right, I'll have a piece of paper towel that I'll use to clean off my brush, take a little bit of the ink out or take a little bit of the water out if I find it's getting a little bit too wet. I can also hold that brush on top of the paper towel, squeeze the reservoir, the water reservoir on that brush, and it will flush water through those bristles and clean them out for a different color. So I'm going to start off by doing the background of this card first. So I'm using some Uncharted Mariner. It's a nice dark blue, but I can work some areas and get them a little bit lighter. I'll do darker areas around, right around the image, and then lighter areas towards the outside. I'm going to be putting my sentiment on the top right open area, so a very similar area to where the sentiment was for the last card. So I'm going to be darker around my florals and greens, and then darker once again around the top corner there, and leave a light spot that I'm going to be putting that sentiment on top. Now, when I'm doing this watercoloring, I do get some streaks in that lighter area. You can keep working it if you want, but sometimes I find working it too much makes those streaks a little bit worse. And I'm going to have, like I said, the sentiment right on top of there. And in my opinion, the florals are what take the attention anyways. For my leaves, I'm using some Bundled Sage Distress ink. So when I do the leaves, I will work that whole leaf and be lighter towards the outside area, darker towards the base of the leaf, as well as the little spine in the center of the leaf. I will start where I want my leaf to be darkest and work my way out. As there's less color on my brush, it's naturally going to be watercoloring lighter. If I find I get too much color, I will brush that color off on the paper towel to my right and lift up some of the color in areas where I feel it's a little bit too dark. If it's too light for me, what I will go and do is dip my brush back into that ink color and dot it in the place that I want it to be darker. Now for my flowers, I'm using some scattered straw for the outer edges of that flower, and I'm going to be using picked raspberry for the inner edges. So I want this to be pink, nice and dark pink towards the center. Going out towards the edges, we're going to have some yellow, and then where those two colors meet, it's going to be a little bit orange in that transition area. So I started off doing that yellow first, then I did the pink in the center, then I removed the color that was on my brush and then just blended those two areas together. And I do work fairly quickly because I don't want those colors to dry out and get some drying spots on that watercolor. But these areas aren't super big, so they have to worry about it. I'm going to do the same process for the second flower, doing that scattered straw around the edges first, then the picked raspberry in the center of the flower, and then clean my brush off and then just kind of blend between those two colors. Now I'm using Distress Reinkers here. You can use whatever method you like or whatever you like for watercoloring. Another option is if you don't have the reinkers for the pads, you can take the pads themselves. Any dye-based pad would work. Smush it onto a non-porous surface and use that as a watercolor palette. You could even use dye-based markers, use them to scribble. However, for markers as well as pads, they're going to be a lighter hue or a lighter tone of the color than you would get with reinkers. With reinkers, you have that option of having that darker area there. So once I have those flowers done, I added a little bit more of a deeper color right behind the blooms on the right side. It wasn't quite as dark as on the left side, so I wanted to add just a little bit more color in some areas. Now when I do that, because that area's had some time to dry, I try to do a larger area and try to not have a large, like I'll try to finish it in a small area between the leaf and the flower or whatever. So if there is a drying spot there, it's in a really tiny area that's not noticeable. So once I have that watercolored, I will let that dry completely. And for this card, I trim them down just like I trimmed the last card. I wanted to see as much of that hibiscus background as possible. So I used the pearl finish cardstock from that Gold Treasured cardstock pack, trim that down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. My hibiscus watercolor piece was trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I wanted just a very small border around the outside edge and just have as much of that background as possible. Once I glued that down, I added my sentiment to that top right corner, and here is our finished piece here. I just love the different look you get to this with the watercolor than you get from the Copics. It's got a completely different vibe to it. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Pineapple Pop embossing folder of the month. So I have a piece of beeswax cardstock here. I'm going to tape it to the embossing folder, and then I'm going to ink the background or the recessed areas of my pineapple. So the raised areas are going to be the pineapple themselves, and they are going to be colored with that beeswax cardstock. The recessed areas are inked with black soot distress ink. So this is going to ink that background black. In order to make sure that you have the right side of your embossing folder, I touch it. If I can feel the pineapples raised, that is the side that I'm going to tape my paper on. The side where the pineapples are recessed, and when I ink it, I only get the background, that is the side we're inking on. So this step gets repeated several times until we have as much ink as we want on our background. Typically for me, it's around 3 times. There's the odd time, depending on the look that I'm wanting, that I will only do it 1 or 2 times. Sometimes I feel that it needs like a 4th time. I keep my pads fairly dry, so it's not really too surprising if it needs a little bit more time, but I'd rather add an extra layer than have my ink pads too wet and get too much ink more ink than I really want on there. So this is why I taped that paper in place. I don't need to worry about that cardstock moving. I can concentrate on inking it, closing that embossing folder, and putting it right back through my machine. And that piece of cardstock was 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Where that tape is covering the cardstock is not going to get inked. So once I take that tape off of there, I can trim this down, and I trim it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches so that I don't see those areas where that tape was on there and it didn't get inked at all. To add some detail to my background here, I'm using a Tombow marker, which is a dye-based marker. I have 098 here that I'm using to color in the greenery. And I'm just starting at the base of the greenery and kind of flicking out. I don't want to color it all green. I want to have the tips yellow. We're just adding some color variation and a little bit of interest to this. You could also use a detailed ink blending brush and ink it with a distress pad if you want. This was just an easy way to color this, but there's several ways to do it. So a distress pad with a detailed brush would also work here. And same with the next step. For the next step, I'm using Tombow marker number 026, which is a darker yellow, to add a little bit of shading to the base of the pineapple. That could also be done with a distress pad or a dye-based pad, and a little bit of ink blending with a detailed blending brush. Now, both my background and these markers here, they're all dye-based. They work well for this. You could use an alcohol marker for this top part here too if you wanted. For the inking of my plates for the background, I like to use dye-based ink pads for this simply because it makes cleaning that ink pad off really, really easy. I only need to run it under a tap of water. I don't need to have any cleaner or anything for it. I just run it under the tap and all of that ink just runs right off there. So once I've colored the bottom of those pineapples, then I'm going to go in and trim this down. And like I said before, I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to use a piece of beeswax cardstock trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat. So this is the same color cardstock that I used when I did my embossing, but because we've added that detail from the markers as well as inked the background, it's not going to be yellow on yellow because we have a lot of that background black because of inking that embossing folder. So I'm gluing everything together with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for gluing cards together like this, but it's also going to work great when I start to put the die cuts together. I can put just a tiny little bit of glue where I need it to go because of that fine tip. So for this card, I simply added one of those sentiments and we are done and ready to go. For my 3D embossing folder, Island Style, I'm going to do the same or a similar technique with different colors. And for the markers that I color over top of it, those are going to be different. They're not going to be Tombow markers. So I position my cardstock on my embossing folder. For this one, I'm using some Fawn cardstock. And then for this one, I'm going to be inking that background in Vintage Photo Distress ink rather than inking it with that black ink and having it really, really stark. However, you could ink it with black and then have a more dramatic effect than what this is, but I wanted to show the same technique off, but with a little bit more of a subtle effect to it. So when I did my machine stacking for the pineapple pop embossing folder, I just did the stacking for a regular embossing folder. This one here is a 3D embossing folder, so it's thicker. So I'm doing the stacking for a 3D embossing folder. So I do the same process. I ink that embossing folder up, I close it, put it through my machine. And once again, this is why I tape that paper in place. I don't need to worry about it moving and shifting on me. It's taped in place. It's going to stay where I put it. And just like before, 3 times was the charm for this one. And you can see it's a much more subtle effect with this. Now I could have used white cardstock, but I'm only going to be coloring 3 of the masks. The rest of them are going to be the fawn color. And I liked the idea of them being the brown color rather than being just completely white. Now I could use Tombow markers for this. However, Tombow markers are a dye-based marker, so they are transparent. I wanted the color on these masks to be nice and opaque as well as matte. So I'm choosing to use some pastel Posca markers. These are acrylic paint markers. You do want to shake them out first. And I'm just trying them out, each one of them on the sheet of paper to my right, just to make sure that that ink is flowing properly before I work on my actual background. When I positioned my paper in the background or in that embossing folder, I had 3 masks in mind that I wanted to have colored on the front of my card. So I made sure that they were a little bit higher on that piece of cardstock so that I had an area to put my sentiment towards the bottom. I'm just using a variety of these Posca markers. Now you could go all out and color all of the masks on here, and I think that would be fun as well. But by only coloring 3 of them, it gives it a little bit of a focal point, a little bit of something a little bit more interesting to look at as well, instead of being kind of an all over pattern. It gives it that focal point to it. Now, because the mask areas that I'm coloring are raised edges, and these markers have a little bit of a rounded point to them, they're really easy to color and get that color exactly where you want them to go. They're also opaque, so it covers over that fawn cardstock. We still get the vibrant color from the Posca markers. And I'm using the pastel set here because I just thought it would be fun for the colors on these masks. But these Posca markers come in so many different colors. You could use whatever color combination you want, and they would look fabulous. So once I have all of my pieces colored as much as I want, I can put those markers away and we can start trimming these down for our card. So I'm going to choose some waterfall cardstock for the mat for this piece. I'm going to trim it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and my embossed piece is going to be trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Once they're trimmed down, we can add them to our A2 card base. Now the one thing to be sure of, because the embossed cardstock has a lot of recessed areas, you want to make sure that you're adding glue to those recessed areas so that it has good contact with the base of the card when you're adding that glue to it. We don't need it on the raised edges because it doesn't have that contact. Once I have that centered on my mat, I can just add a very simple sentiment, and we have a very simple card. But because those masks, there's only 3 of them that are colored, those are the focal area. That's what your eye gets drawn to, and it creates a really interesting background. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Plumeria Spray Stencil of the Month. This is a layering stencil set. I'm going to be using my sticky mat to hold my cardstock. Now, to make it really easy to layer the different layers, I put some painter's tape on the top left corner and the bottom right corner. There are markings on the 4 corners showing you where the edges of the cardstock should be. I find this works easy as well. So I always add those registration marks on the top left, the bottom right. It doesn't need to be all 4 corners. If we've got the top left and the bottom right, we're good to go. And then because there's not a lot of area sticking to the mat from that stencil, I add a little bit of painter's tape to the bottom and the top to hold it in place. For the inking for my leaf here, I'm using some Salvage Patina first, and then I'm going in with Evergreen Bough towards the center of the leaf and where that leaf is below those flowers. Then I'm going to take this layer off and go and do the next layer. The next layer is some of those flowers. So once again, I just match up that top left corner, the bottom right corner, put the painter's tape to secure my stencil on my mat. For the first layer for my flowers, I'm using some Spun Sugar. This is a really nice light pink. Obviously, with these flowers, you can use a variety of different color combinations if you want. They're very, very simple flowers for this stenciled background, but they've got several different layers to them to add some extra detail, and they're just really, really pretty. So after doing the spun sugar, we can move on to the next stencil. So the next stencil does the center of those flowers. I'm going to be doing the center of those flowers, some Kitsch Flamingo, and then I end up adding some interference ink because there wasn't quite enough contrast between that spun sugar and the Kitsch Flamingo for the look that I was going for. And you'll see that as soon as I lift up the stencil, that, I mean, there's a little bit of difference between the spun sugar and the Kitsch Flamingo, but really not a whole lot. So I go in and grab the pink champagne interference ink. This is not only going to add some bright, vibrant color in the center of those flowers, but it's also going to add that shimmer to it. So I put that stencil right back down again, layering them together, grabbed my pink champagne interference ink, and go and ink the center of the flower. So we're going to have a lot more contrast, and that's going to have this shimmer to it. If you've never used interference inks before, it's like 2 pads in one. These ink pads show up one color on white or light cardstock, a completely different color on black or dark cardstock. For the pink champagne, we have a bright, vibrant pink showing up on the white or light, but there is a green interference to it. So even with that pink champagne on there, we see that pink, but when we tilt it into the light, we're going to get a little bit of green shimmer. For the next layer, it's got some edge detail to the flowers. I decided to use the Natural Pearl pad. This one, we're not going to see color on the white, but we're just going to see some pearl shimmer there. Another option would be to use a different color pad, say some picked raspberry distress ink, or just a different color to add a little bit more detail to it. This is really, really subtle because it's pearl on white. So we're just seeing a little bit of shimmer when we tilt it into the light. The last layer does the veins on the leaves as well as the center of the flowers. So once we have these layered all together and lined up, I'm going to be using some pine needles distress ink. We're going to be pretty heavy on the center of the flowers and heavier on the leaves towards the center, lighter towards the outside part of those leaves, so that we get a little bit of visual contrast. Then I want to add some visual texture or some glitter texture to the leaf centers. So I'm using some Nebula Stickles glitter paste. I often will use the Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. It's an iridescent. The Nebula one has some gold accents and gold stars in it. So it's going to coordinate nicely with the different gold accents that we have in the rest of the cards in this video. I'm going to be using one of those sentiments that we had embossed from the Clear Stamp of the Month. So that has gold to it. So it's going to coordinate with that. So I lift my stencil up. I let it dry for probably about an hour. Then I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. While waiting for my background to dry, I completely cleaned off my stencils, especially the one that had the glitter paste on it. We don't want to let it dry on the stencil. You probably could get it off if it dried, but it's going to take a lot more elbow grease, and it's probably going to damage your stencil while you're cleaning it. For the mat for this card, I took a piece of Hammermill cardstock, trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and used that pink champagne interference ink just to rub around the outside edges for that mat. So that is going to coordinate perfectly with one of the layers of our flowers, and it's going to give it a really nice edge to or frame around that background. Once I have the stenciled piece glued to the center, we can add our sentiment to the front of it. And again, a super simple card with a beautiful background, but I really love that glitter you get, the texture you get from the flower centers being that Stickers glitter gel. It gives it a little bit of or extra texture as well as something to catch the eye. For my next 2 cards, I'm going to be using the Luau Beats Stitching Die of the Month. I'm going to do one of them with the guitar and the smaller florals. The next one is going to be the drum and the larger florals, but you could combine the 2 all in one if you wanted. So I have my guitar pieces die cut out of some fawn cardstock and acorn cardstock. For this one, the stitching is the strings on the guitar, and I'm using some DMC floss. It's number 739, and we're just doing the very simple stitching of those strings to the top of the guitar, and it's super simple stitching because there's only 4 strings here. I do use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to secure that floss when I start as well as when I finish. Once I have that done, we can add the back part of the guitar, and I have that just die cut out of some acorn cardstock, but you could do something completely different, a different color like black or something, so that there's a little bit more shadow to it. Then we have two pieces that go on the top of the guitar over top of that stitching. Anytime I use stitching dies, because we get a little bit of extra dimension from that floss, I use some sewing clips in order to hold that cardstock in place, making sure that glue has good contact while it dries. It just makes it really, really easy to make sure that everything sticks together and holds in place rather than holding it with your fingers. You can go and do something else for a few minutes while those are holding. Now, while that is drying, I'm going to assemble my flowers here. So we have the flowers die cut out of some white cardstock, dahlia, and wildberry cardstock. The centers of the flowers are die cut out of beeswax cardstock, and then we have leaves with peridot and rainforest cardstock. For the background for this card, I have some waterfall cardstock, and I'm just using some evergreen bough and pine needles to create a bit of an ombre look on the background. So we started with the evergreen bough going up about 2/3 of the way, and then the pine needles going up about 1/3, and just kind of transitioning that color. Just gives it a little bit more interest on the background than just one plain solid color. Now, once I have this done, I'm going to trim down my mat here is done with fern cardstock, trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My ombre background that we just ink blended is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. We can layer those together. And I messed up with filming. I messed up with pressing my buttons, so I didn't get a chance to film the actual putting the guitar on the background, but it's really, really simple. I just put the guitar on there. My flowers were all dry. I just tucked them towards the bottom so that it had a base to stand on, and then added my sentiment lower than that. Now, I did put a little dot of stickles in the center of the flowers just to give them a little bit of different texture as well as sparkle, something else to catch the light. For the next card, I'm going to be using the large leaves from this set, as well as the drum and the larger flowers. So I have 2 of the leaves that I've stitched off screen. For the leaves themselves, I'm using DMC floss number 907. When I do the stitching, I use 2 strands of the floss, so I don't use the entire floss. It would be a little bit too thick. Once again, just like my guitar, I use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to secure that floss when I first start stitching. That way I don't have to hold it. Then once I'm done, I'll use a little bit to secure the end of the floss as well. Now, for these leaves, there's an outer die for the leaf itself, so you could die cut it without the stitching if you wanted. And then there's an inner layer for that stitching piece. So I've die cut both. I have a solid leaf as well as a leaf with all of those stitching holes. Once I'm done stitching them, I'm going to glue the stitched leaf to the solid leaf, and I typically like to do this with stitching dies so that when I go to glue my cards together, I have solid cardstock to glue it with. I don't have all of the dimension of the stitching. It gives those stitched pieces a little bit of extra dimension, a little bit of extra weight to them as well. So I glue those together with that Bearly Art glue, and then use those sewing clips in order to hold those pieces together while they dry. And while they are drying, I can do the stitching on the coffee cup. So the coffee cup itself has several layers. The lid has 2 pieces on its own. Then there's the main coffee cup piece, and then there's 2 underneath layers for the extra detail. And then there's that bottom rim. So we don't need to glue all of those pieces together at once. We want to do our stitching first, and then we can glue those extra details to it. So for the coffee lid, it looks like just a straight line for that stitching. So I go up 1 hole, down the next, up the next, and then back down. So we're just filling in those areas. You could also do a running stitch, up 1, down the next, up the next, down the next, all the way to the end, and then turn around and fill in those pieces. Just like my leaves, I like to put a little piece of Best Ever Craft tape to secure my floss at the beginning and at the end. Once I have that piece done, we can add the top part to the lid, and then we can set those aside to let those dry while we're doing the stitching on the cup. Now, the stitching on the cup, it kind of looks like V lines, if you will, almost like a drum. When you die cut the stitching dies, it often puts a little line, a little indent showing you where the stitching is intended to go. So it makes it really easy to follow it. I'll also sometimes look at the front of the packaging to see how they intend for it to go. most of the time the stitching is really quite simple, but you can get elaborate if you wanted. Like if you wanted to change this up, you could probably do like a crisscross pattern or something, just to get a little bit creative with it. I don't necessarily find that I need to get creative with the stitching dies often, but they're just a fun way to add a little bit of extra texture to different die cut pieces, something that's a little bit unexpected for most die cut cards. So I ran out of floss halfway through here, so I put a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to secure that piece. Then I start stitching again, once again putting a little piece of tape on the back to hold it in place. Then we can finish up all of these little notches here. So again, the stitching comes together really, really quickly. Like it's not something that takes a really long time, especially for really simple pieces like this. There are some stitching dies that are a little bit more elaborate. I find that it just is a calm zen thing just to do the stitching on them. And like I said before, I just like that it adds a little bit of extra texture. I'm always looking for different ways to add different texture to my cards. And by using stitching dies, sometimes it just does that all on its own. So once I'm done that stitching, once again, I can use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to tape that piece in place, trim off my floss, and now we're ready to add those layers beneath there. So there's one layer that goes right underneath here that has those die cut shapes out of it. It just adds some pattern detail to the back. That one is die cut out of some fern cardstock. The coffee cup base is die cut out of acorn cardstock. And then this underlaying piece is die cut out of some dahlia cardstock. We can use those sewing clips to hold those pieces together. Then we can glue our coffee cup lid to the top. Because some of these pieces have that dimension from the floss underneath that, by using those clips, they're nice and secure. It just makes it really easy to put them together again, rather than sitting there holding them with your fingers, because on their own, that isn't going to have a whole lot of contact with it. So they do make it really easy to use, and I just have them sitting there ready to go, ready to grab when I need them. So I'm going to let that dry for a few minutes while I assemble my flowers. The base of the flower is die cut out of some dahlia cardstock. The upper layer is white cardstock. Now these flowers are not symmetrical, so there is a certain way that the upper layer goes, and you'll notice as I'm putting them down, I think I have it right, and then I have to twist it and turn it till we get all of the petals lining up properly. But this is the nice thing about using liquid glue, is it makes it really easy to lift those pieces up and turn them around to get it to layer properly. After we have those three flowers layered properly, we can add that center to it. So I'm just putting a little dot of glue in the center and using the wax tool from the handy tool set to lift that little tiny star piece from that flower center and put it onto that dot of glue. I'm going to do this background the same as I did that last one. So we're going to use some evergreen bough and some pine needles on top of waterfall cardstock. Once again, going about 2/3 up with that evergreen bough and then about 1/3 up with that pine needles. For this one, I did it a little bit darker than the last one. You can do it as light or as dark as you want. Again, adding the ink to it just gives it a little bit of interest that just plain cardstock doesn't have. So for my mat, I once again used fern cardstock for this one, and that was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The background that we did the ink on is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I'm going to add my coffee cup first, as well as my sentiment, and then we're going to tuck in the leaves and the flowers behind it. So that sentiment is going to go in the bottom right corner. You could also put it right on top of the coffee cup, but I didn't want to lose any of that stitch detail or cover any of that stitch detail up. I added that coffee cup to the center of the card with that liquid glue. And because of that liquid glue, it makes it really easy to be able to pick up the areas of the mug to tuck some of those leaf stems into. So those leaves are die cut out of peridot cardstock as well as rainforest cardstock for a little bit of color variation. I did 2 of them towards the bottom left, 1 towards the bottom right, and then we're going to add those flowers. Now, often with flowers, I like to use my fingers to add a little bit of curved detail to the petals. It just gives it a little bit of, it's just not as flat. So it just looks a little bit more interesting to have the curved petals on there. You could also put foam pop dots in behind there if you wanted to support those curves. They're really, really quite subtle. You can't get a lot of curved because we already have 2 layers of cardstock glued together. But again, it just adds a little bit of curve to it, a little bit of softness to those petals. The last step here was adding just a dot of stickles to the centers of the flowers, and then I set that aside to dry, and we're ready to put this adorable turtle together from the Mahalo Sea Turtle Die of the Month. So I have the sea turtle die cut out of rainforest cardstock that I'm putting onto the background layer, which is die cut out of fern cardstock. Then I have a piece that is peridot cardstock. This is the back shell. I should have put it between the two before gluing them together, but I just squeeze them in there. And that's, again, another nice thing about liquid glue is if you make a mistake like that, it's super easy to correct. Then we have the belly piece that is also die cut out of that peridot cardstock. There are two different eye pieces. One that goes behind that hole in the eye, that is die cut out of just a scrap of white cardstock. And then there's the eye detail die cut out of some raven cardstock that, once again, I just put the glue in that eye hole around the outside edges and then used my wax pickup tool to just put that eye in there. Now we can set that off to the side and we're ready to work on the background here. So I have two different dies that are created for that background. There is an outside die and an inside die. I'm using some Best Ever craft tape to tape them together to make sure those are nice and evenly spaced. And then I'm die cutting some waterfall cardstock out of that. Now, before I go and assemble anything, I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock for the front of my card. That is going to be die cut with the inner die. I have it taped in the center. The sentiment I'm going to be using with this card is something about chasing rainbows. I don't remember the exact sentiment, but I just thought it would be really fun for the front of the card for this piece here to kind of do a little bit of a rainbow ombre look for the background. I thought it worked well with that rainbow sentiment. So we're going to have the pieces for the ocean for the frame part of it. That's the part out of that waterfall cardstock that we die cut. And then to go behind those openings, I have some blue spruce cardstock. So the blue spruce is going to go behind the openings, but it's also going to frame it and mat it. So that is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. My hammer mill piece, before doing the ink blend, ink blending, I trimmed it down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. So I'm starting with one of the lightest colors. So I chose some squeezed lemonade here. On the top, I'm doing some picked raspberry. That squeezed lemonade and the picked raspberry are going to blend together and create an orange. Then I'm using the evergreen bough right below the squeezed lemonade, and I'm going to be using some Uncharted Mariner right at the bottom on top of that evergreen bough. I'm also going to take that Uncharted Mariner and just put a little bit towards the top to create a purple and complete that rainbow there. Only need a tiny little bit. We only need the suggestion of that purple there. Again, this is not typical watercolors, but because the sentiment that I had left over for this card said something about rainbows, I thought this was just a fun twist on it and something a little bit unexpected. So once we have that ink blending down, we can start to assemble our card here. So I'm going to put that piece of blue spruce down. Then we can glue this piece here onto the front. Now, another option here would be to use some acetate right behind these openings and create a shaker in that background. I think that would be fun as well. I opted not to do that, but I just wanted to mention that that would be a fun way to use these openings with that sea turtle. I think it'd be a great shaker card with a really unique shaker window there. For this front frame piece, I'm just putting that Barely Art glue on there. And this is one reason why it's nice to have a really fine line bottle, because you can use as much or as little as you need. And you'll see me kind of flicking some of those opening pieces a little bit. Some of those holes didn't completely, the pieces didn't fall right out when I pierced them. So they stuck to the back, so I had to make sure that they were off there before we added that to our card. Then we're adding our sentiment to the bottom. I left the sentiment white, so it was nice bright white against the rainbow. You could color it if you wanted, but I think it looks great as that nice bright white on the window. It's a little bit more visible. Once I glued that turtle down, I put the acrylic block on there till it was dry, and then used a dot of glossy accents on the eye of the turtle just to give it that glossy dome dimension. And again, just a little bit of a different texture. You could also use that glossy accents in those holes on the turtle as well, but I didn't want to add too much to it. For the next card, I'm using the Tropical Blooms large die of the month for the florals. I have 6 flowers die cut, and they're die cut with 2-2 for the base. For the upper layers, I use some Wildberry cardstock as well as Dahlia cardstock, and I have them all layered a little bit differently. So there's a little bit of variety in the different blooms. Now I'm going to just do one on screen. The other ones I'll do off screen because it's going to be really repetitive. Once I have those pieces glued on top there, I use a little bit of picked raspberry for the center of the flower for a little bit of color variation, a little bit of shading. And then I use some mowed lawn for the base of the leaf. I don't want to ink blend the whole thing, just a little bit on the base just to give it a little bit of variation. For the centers of the flowers, I have them die cut out of glitter cardstock from the Rose Gold Treasured Cardstock pack. Because we have a lot of gold accents on the different cards here, you could use the gold, but in my opinion, the gold from the Gold Treasured Cardstock pack is really quite yellow, and I didn't really like it. I preferred the color that came out of the rose gold one. So that's what I opted for these flowers, but you could easily change it with a different color if you want. For the Aloha from this set, I have the top layer die cut out of the glitter cardstock from the Antique White Treasured Cardstock pack. Then I have the shadow for the letters die cut out of Anchor cardstock. So it's a nice dark gray. I just thought it would add some variation to the letters and give them a little bit more of a bold statement rather than just having the letters just out of that glitter cardstock. For the background, I'm once again using some waterfall cardstock. I'm ink blending with evergreen bough around the outside edges. This was trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so there's no extra mat around this. This is just the background of the card, but we'll still see that white A2 card base behind it. I'm going to put the letters on first for Aloha, and then I'm going to add the flowers behind it and just tuck them underneath. So that glue is going to take long enough to dry that we're going to have enough time to be shifting and moving things as well as tucking those florals and leaves behind there. So off screen, I did the rest of those florals so they're ready to go. I want to just tuck them in behind the Aloha sentiment. Now I have 6 florals total and 5 leaves. You could do more if you wanted, but I really still want to see that ink blended background. I don't want to completely cover it. As I'm putting these florals behind, I'm trying to keep it balanced. So I did 1 floral and 1 leaf in the top left corner. We have 2 flowers and 1 leaf in the bottom left corner. Then we have 1 flower towards the bottom right, and I'm going to put a leaf in behind that as well. Then we have 2 more flowers left, and I'm going to put those on the top right of the Aloha. And obviously you could change the arrangement of the flowers if you want it. You could also have them in a bunch of different colors, but I do typically like just one kind of color palette, one color family with them. Then we have those 2 extra leaves that we're putting in or behind those flowers in the top right. Super simple card. It probably took way longer to do the die cutting for this than it did for assembling the whole thing, but that glitter cardstock in the front of the Aloha really just finishes it and takes it to the next level in my opinion. For this next card, we're using the Penguin in Paradise die set. I have him die cut out of Raven cardstock as well as classic white cardstock. And then the details for his cheeks as well as his beak, they're just done with some pink cardstock, the 2-2 cardstock. Glue them in place. Just put a little dot of that Barely Art glue and use that wax tool to lift it up and poke it in place or put it in place. When you do the die cutting of the white piece, it leaves a little indent showing you exactly where the cheeks and the nose go or the beak goes. So it makes it really, really easy. For the headpiece as well as his little grass skirt there, those are die cut out of some rainforest cardstock. I opted not to do ink blending for him, but you certainly could do a little bit of ink blending if you wanted some color variation on that. For the background, I have some waterfall cardstock here that I'm doing a little bit of ink blending with some Uncharted Mariner. I have the grass on the bottom that I die cut using the border die on the Aloha Hulu die set. That's the All Crate exclusive die set. You could easily just trim that with scissors though if you don't happen to have that one, or if you wanted it to be a little bit different from that. I did ink blending on that green piece that was die cut out of rainforest cardstock. I just did a little bit of ink blending with mowed lawn distress ink there towards the bottom. I'm going to glue that towards the top. For this one, I did a mat that was out of Raven cardstock that's trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My waterfall piece was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches before doing that ink blending. And then I just added those to the back with a sentiment. Super, super simple card, but I just think that penguin is absolutely adorable. So cute with the little grass skirt and the headpiece there. For my last card, I'm using the Aloha Hulu. So we're going to assemble her first, and then we're going to make her interactive. So I want her little hulu skirt, the little grass skirt there, I want it to tilt like she's actually doing a hulu dance. So we're going to assemble her first, and then I'll show you how to do that. So I have her hair die cut out of some Raven cardstock. Her body pieces are die cut out of Bellini cardstock. The flowers, the dark pink ones, are Wildberry cardstock, and for her headpiece, the underlayer is done with some beeswax cardstock. Little cheek pieces there are tutu cardstock, and again, you could just change up these colors. It doesn't need to be these exact colors either. I just liked the dark pinks with the yellow for the flowers, and then for her grass skirt and the overlayers there, that is rainforest cardstock, and the upper layers are die cut out of some peridot cardstock. And I opt not to do any ink blending on these either because of the interactive element to it, but you certainly could if you want to. Now there's little pieces that go on her feet here. If you decide to put your sentiment where I end up putting mine, this is absolutely not necessary because it gets covered up, but you could also put your sentiment towards the top. I opted not to put it towards the top of the card because then it was going to cover her hair and the top of her headpiece, and I thought her ankles were less important than that, so I opted to put the sentiment towards the bottom. Another option would be to put the sentiment on the inside of the card. So now that she is done, we can add, or we can assemble her skirt. So that under layer, like I said, is rainforest cardstock. The upper layer is some peridot. We're going to glue those together, and then the waist piece here for this is die cut out of some beeswax cardstock, and then we've got some flowers die cut out of tutu cardstock. So doing this with glue or with the liquid glue makes it super easy because you can move and shimmy those dies in place how you get them exactly how you want them. You'll notice here when I lift up my acrylic block, it's stuck to those flower pieces there. So you want to make sure that you add enough glue so that it has contact with the cardstock underneath. I hadn't actually added enough glue to it. So the background piece for this, again, is waterfall cardstock trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm doing the inking for this one exactly the same as the last card. So we're using some Uncharted Mariner around the outside edges. We have our grass piece die cut out of rainforest cardstock and just using some Modelon Distress ink on that bottom piece. So we're going to assemble pretty much the whole card other than that grass skirt. Now another option for this card is there is I think it's a tiki torch, I think that's what it's called, that you could also put on here. Another alternative way to make this interactive would be to just glue her grass skirt to her and then say use a Pear Blossom Press One Light or Twinkle Light for the tiki torch. If you wanted to light up the flame there and use some colored vellum, I think that would be fun as well. Didn't want to go too far and create too many interactive elements though. So I have a little circle die here from the Like to Move It die set. I'm die cutting it right where I want the grass skirt to be. I'm going to be using a snap and spin for the mechanism for that grass skirt to stick on, and I'm going to be creating a pendulum mechanism so that when we tilt the card back and forth, it's going to have that grass skirt moving back and forth. So because we are die cutting 3 different layers of cardstock, we've got the background layer, her upper body layer, as well as her leg layer. We do have to go through the die cutting machine a few times here. So the first time I went in, I lifted up the die and just kind of removed those cardstock pieces. This entire area gets hidden with the grass skirt. So if we get some indents from that die or indents from the tape, it's not going to matter. It's going to be hidden. So I've got that little pendulum or that little snap and spin piece in there. I'm going to create a pendulum for it. So I'm taking a scrap of white cardstock, I trimmed it to 1/2 inch wide, and then I just measured it on my card to see how long it needed to be, and it ended up being 2 inches. I'm going to be using a sticky spot to glue a little washer to the bottom of it. This is going to give it some weight for that pendulum. So I put that sticky spot on there. I'm going to put the washer on there, and then I'm using a little bit of embossing powder tool just to remove any exposed sticky dot stickiness so it doesn't accidentally stick to something that I don't want it to. And then because we created a long rectangle here, I'm just using my detail scissors to trim off the edges so we don't have any pokey areas that might stick into our foam tape and get wedged in there. So by trimming that down, we have all curved edges down there. I used a sticky spot to glue that pendulum to the top of that, or the top of that pendulum onto that snap and spin. And then I'm going to glue my little hula skirt on there. So we're going to test this before we put anything together. So you can see how that moves back and forth. That works perfectly. I want to use a little piece of Best Ever Craft tape to hold that in place. And then I'm using some double thick foam tape. You'll see it linked in my supply list down below, as well as all of the other supplies that I'm using. We want to make sure that the tape that we're using is thick enough so that pendulum can swing freely. We don't want it to be too tight in there and get wedged in one area. So once I have the whole background supported with that foam tape, I'm also going to put a thin piece on the bottom so that we don't see the pendulum if we look between the layers. We can turn this around, and I'm going to take that little piece of Best Ever Craft tape. I'm going to put it on the front of the card so that we can remove it once everything is glued together. I don't want my skirt to be moving and swinging while I am assembling my card and have that pendulum wedge underneath our foam tape and accidentally get taped down. So our mat for this card is just a piece of Raven cardstock trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I can take the backing off of our back piece here, and then we can glue it to our mat. And like I said, because we have that piece of Best Ever Craft tape on our little skirt on the front of the card, that pendulum on the back is not going to move where it's not supposed to. We can take the tape off of there and we can swing it, and our grass skirt moves. Now you could widen the areas where that tape was if you want that skirt to move a little bit more. I tend to err on the side of caution and have it move just a little bit, not too much. I added that sentiment to the bottom, but like I said earlier, you could put it towards the top of the card if you wanted. The last step I want to do here is just little dots of stickles in the centers of the flowers, just to add that sparkle and that extra little bit of texture. And because they're only dots, they only take like maybe 15-20 minutes to dry. It doesn't take a long time for that to dry. But the final result is an absolutely adorable interactive card. I love the fact that it just looks like, or her grass skirt is moving and it looks like she's doing the hula. You could also still add that tiki torch on the side if you wanted to, but I wanted to keep it a little bit simple. Next, we have our Penguin in Paradise, and you could do the pendulum card for this as well. It'd be a little bit different. I would put him a little bit higher on the card so the pendulum had an area below him to swing, but that would be adorable as well, and another way to use that one. Then we have our tropical blooms with the aloha in the center. I just love those little hibiscus flowers. They're absolutely gorgeous with that glittered sentiment in the center. Then we have our adorable little turtle that is chasing rainbows. So cute. And that turtle could be used all on its own or with the background die that comes with it. You can pick and choose. Then we have our 2 different cards that we created with that stitching die of the month. I love this little drum. I just think it's absolutely adorable. You could also do a second drum and have a pair of them if you wanted, with those blooms to the side of it. And then we have our adorable guitar. I just love that guitar. I think it's just so cute. So many different ways to use them. I think it would also be fun. I think it's scaled perfectly that you could put that guitar in the hula girl's hands. I think that would suit her totally as well, and have her playing guitar while she's doing the hula. Then we have our Plumeria stencil background. Such a simple background, and all it really needs is a little sentiment on the front, but I really love the extra sparkle you get from the Stickers glitter gel in the background. Now we have the island style mask background that you could put underneath some of the different dies that we've used, but I really love it with the Posca marker on the front. And then same with our pineapple background. You could put it with behind other dies as well, but it really creates a unique background all on its own. Then the 2 using the Hibiscus bloom press and foil plates. This one done in the Better Press system using watercolor cardstock and then watercoloring the background. And then a completely different vibe by using it in the Glimmer system with that matte gold glimmer foil. I just think it's absolutely beautiful with that cut edge on there. It creates a really unique look to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.